but that's closer to like the historical society and those kinds of organizations are. But like how?
My name is Tom McMullen. I'm one of the 4 owners of Tumbling Creek Cider Company. So my special guest tonight is Mr. Ed Morgan. Looks like everyone here probably knows him. I suspect everybody's nodding their head. That's good. That's good. I've known Ed since I moved down here 28 years ago through the Creek Patrol Club, actually. My wife and I were the president and secretary of that for a few years. But the first time I met the 2 Eds was because that's also when their Virginia Creek Patrol companion book came out. And so Ed here was also with Dr. Ed Davis. The 2 of them wrote a really awesome book about the Creeper Trail. And I think it still holds pretty good water, doesn't it?
I think so.
I think so
too. A few changes along the way.
But Ed is somebody who's lived here for, what, 50? Trying to remember what you told me the other 50-ish?
I came to this community in 1968.
1968.
As a student at Emory and Henry.
So that would be 57 years?
Yeah.
Wow. All right. Well, that's awesome. Well, anyway, here is my guest, Ed Morgan, and he's going to tell us a lot of interesting things that he's done in the last 57 years or so in the region, especially here in Abingdon, but also at the foundation of the Creeper Trail and also on the Mount Rogers National Rec area.
All right. Very good, and thank you. And I appreciate the opportunity to come out today and reminisce a little bit about my time here in Abingdon. And I'm going to speak today a bit, somewhat about the history of the town and my intersection with it.
Face it towards, like you have to point it at your face.
All right, we'll try that again.
Is that better? And then really, like right up against it.
All right, well, we'll see if that'll work.
Let's see if I can mark.
I'm going to talk a bit, about the history of Abingdon and my intersection with it. And let me say, first of all, that I'm very grateful to Tumbling Creek and the Historic Society and WEHC for giving me the opportunity to be here today.
I'm trying to get Ed to point it at his face, but it's
coming out and
as you can tell.
And encouraging.
Yeah, I'll keep reminding.
Showing up here today does only that, and I'm very grateful for your interest. And hopefully, I'll be able to tell you some things that that you may or may not have heard before. I'm particularly pleased to see Richard Smith with us today. Dick and I go back a very long ways and have had some intersections in our career course and life here in the community in the past. But I'd like to start out talking a little bit about Abingdon. I served on the Abingdon, Virginia Town Council for 16 years. I was elected to office in the year 2000, and again served on the council for that period of time. And I became mayor of Abingdon in 2010. And I have always had a strong interest in the history of our community. And one of the questions or thoughts I had and I sort of wrestled with over the years was how and why did Abingdon end up to be different from the other communities, in this part of the world? What makes us different from a Glade Spring or a Chilhowie or a Lebanon? And why are we such a unique and vibrant community? One of the things I frequently talked about too was the town of Abingdon seal and the town motto, which is honor pro antiques, fides pro futuritas. Now, I didn't get to take Latin when I was in high school, but I think that roughly translates as honor and respect for the past and hope for the future. And I think it's a very good motto for our town because we certainly appreciate the remarkable history and individuals who've come through our community. And we are a vibrant community that I think has great hope for the future and what our town will be, and that it will continue to be a good place to live. The early start, one of the reasons that Abingdon ended up, there's several reasons, and they're mostly pretty simple. One of the reasons it was different was that we got an early start. We got a jump on everybody else, and having a little bit longer time period to shape your town and its direction and so forth is very much of a beginning point. We were incorporated in, I think, 1778. It was a good long time ago, and we became a very vibrant center of this part of the world early on. I think the first and only post office in Southwest Virginia was here in Abingdon until about 1830. So having, that big early start was a great part of what shaped us. Another thing was our location. This is a good spot, first of all, to live and to farm and do that kind of a thing here in your community. But also, it was we're located in the Great Valley of Virginia in terms of transportation, getting through this part of the world. The Great Valley Road was built through here. The railroad came through here. And we are located where if you wanted to go north into what became the coal fields, this was the place to begin. If you wanted to go west, well, we're pointing in that direction, or south into North Carolina, we are here. So our location was very much a part of the answer to that question. We also had outstanding leadership early on here. And if you look at the folks who organized the the group that went to fight in the Battle of Kings Mountain, the Campbells and Edmondsons and all the other families that were involved in that, it was a remarkable thing to be living in a place that was very rural and isolated, and round up about 400 men in their gear and march them to South Carolina and successfully defeat a force down there. Plus leaving a group back here to watch out for the Indians who were going to know that you were gone. And the leadership of the people that were here and able to organize that was just truly a remarkable thing. And I feel like the Battle of Kings Mountain and what we had there was really sort of a bonding sort of a point for a lot of the people that lived here. In the course of taking on that task, they got to know each other, relate to each other, trust each other, and that kind of relationship helped to shape, the future that we had in our community. Another important factor was that there was money here, and a lot of money, and we, really don't take that in so much. But the money that we had here in this community that was owned by the Prestons and William King and the White family and, a number of others, it came from Saltville. We had at Saltville, Virginia, we had the salt wells. Salt was a product that was very much in demand, not just for adding to your food, but for preserving food and tanning leather and many other things along the way. Salt was very important, and it was hard to come by. And so we had the salt wells that were located where they are in Saltville. And the people, Saltville was not necessarily a good place to live in the time it was in production. It would have been a very smoky industrial town, with a lot of noise and things going on all the time. So the people that owned the salt wells and so forth, they lived in Abingdon. And they took the money that they had from leasing out the salt wells to others and invested it here in Abingdon in fine homes and political connections and that kind of thing. Their sons did well, were involved in politics and different things. Their daughters, married well. And Abingdon was an extremely important community in this part of the world prior to the Civil War. William King, who the William King School or Museum is named after, was considered at one time to be the wealthiest man in the United States. Now, that's a hard thing to get your head around, but the wealthiest man in the United States lived here. And he was not the only one who was wealthy. There was also a Mr. White who set up, processes or for selling salt, down through along the Tennessee River, and established trading posts and so forth. Those people had money. And, again, they put it to good use. They bought influence with it, but they built big houses here, such as, what became the Martha Washington Inn. And they established an architectural standard that others had to live up to. So we see that money being put to very practical use here. The other thing was that they had a very strong commitment to education. And we look at the Abingdon Male Academy, which was built originally on the site of William King. Here it is, providing education for young men. And there weren't a whole lot of places in this part of the world that provided educational opportunities. Maybe if you were wealthy, you had a tutor or somebody, but this school that we had here in town, it turned out, a generation of people that became governors and senators and lawyers and religious leaders. It had a tremendous influence. I think ultimately during the Civil War, there were 7 generals who had lived here in Washington County and have been educated here. Now, in addition to the commitment that we have with the Abingdon Male Academy, there were 3 schools in the town that provided higher education to women. There was the Martha Washington College, which is now the Martha Washington Inn. We had the Stonewall Jackson Academy. And then there was also the Catholic, what's the word I'm looking for? There was the nuns ran a school. What was the name of that place?
I'm not sure the name, but there was one here.
Yeah, it was over there. Yes, on the east end of town. So, and then you had Emory and Henry providing education for men. So we had the general climate and level of education and culture that existed in this town really didn't exist in too many other places in Virginia. And until the land grant college system came around, there weren't many colleges out there. You know, there was no Virginia Tech. There was a University of Virginia, but there's no Virginia Tech. And places like Emory and Henry and these schools that we're describing, they were important in terms of shaping several generations of people and continue to be so. And there are a lot of people we would note that from this part of the world that immigrated to Texas. And there was a strong connection to Virginia, the Houstons and the Austins and the other families, that migrated out of here. And when they needed education, a lot of them came back here to Emory and Henry. And that was fairly noted for a number of years. So the groundwork was laid here for this community. And, there were, again, several factors that really distinguished it from the other communities in this part of the world, and continue to, that legacy continues today. And we see a community here now that continues to, be vibrant, be well educated, an appealing place to live. And that's one of the things that really, is noted to me. I would also note that when I was serving on the town council, I tried very hard to educate myself and study and learn and, be the most effective person that I could. And I read a lot. And one of the books that I read that really influenced what my approach to things was a book by Richard Florida. And Richard Florida wrote a book called The Rise of the Creative Class. And his book was really looking at what factors that the movers and shakers in the world, so to speak, or at least in the United States, what influenced where they wanted to live. And he noted that there were a couple of things that were not important to them and were really negatives. One of which was they weren't looking for big shopping malls. They weren't looking for that kind of situation. And they were not looking for places that had big sports teams and football and that kind of thing. What they were looking for the most part, were places that were unique, that had their own character, that were authentic was really the word that they were looking for. Places that, were distinguished from every other burg and out there, that all looked the same. And they were also looking for a place where they could have an influence on the direction of the community, what life was like there in that community. And they were looking as well at outdoor recreation opportunities. And I see an awful lot of Abingdon in that description of what people were looking for. They were, again, looking for, these kind of communities. One of the things that surprised me when I read it in terms of what made a community important was their, what's the word I'm looking for? Their gay index was a term that they were looking for. And this was the thing that really surprised me when I saw it, but they were looking and would note whether there were gay people living in the community and whether, there were many of them living in the community. And what that said to them, and particularly to the women, it noted, was that this was a place that was open and safe, and where you could be comfortable, you could feel all right, that you could be accepted for who you were. And so that was something that really came as a surprise to me. They also said that the author also noted that your community's music scene could probably be as important as what you had in your industrial park. So it really had quite an influence on my thinking, and it made me to realize, that Abingdon has an awful lot going for it, and that we needed to maintain those things in the future if we're going to continue to grow and be, a unique and desirable community. Another thing that happened that really stuck in my mind was that I guess it was the Board of Architectural Review brought in Joe Riley, who was is now the former mayor of Charleston, South Carolina. Now, Charleston's been of course, it's about to wash away, but Charleston has been a pretty successful community, by just about anybody's standards. And Joe came up here to talk about what it was that, made Charleston successful. And the thing that he said and emphasized to people and told us in 3 or 4 different ways was that, first of all, your community needs to be a good place to live, not just a place to do business, and not just a place to go, for entertainment or, activities or that kind of thing. It needed to be a good place to live. And he said that if it was a good place to live, then everything else would take care of itself. And that really struck with me and, again, influenced my thinking. Now, I'm going to talk in a little bit about some aspects of my service on the town council. But I'll just say one other thing about that before I move on to what brought me to Abingdon. And that is that when I look at the history of Abingdon, I was taken by a quote in Lewis Preston Summers' book, The Annals of Southwest Virginia. Now, his book is kind of a mess in some regards. There's all kinds of stuff in there, and you're not sure where he got it or who said it or anything like that. But he had a quote in there that makes me think a little bit about where I am today. And I feel like, I'm grateful that I've had this opportunity, but I feel like it's almost a valedictory speech for me, where I'm recognized at this point in time as being a local institution because of my longevity and involvement with things. But I will, at some point soon, metamorphose into a local character, or perhaps a town eccentric, or a noted gadfly, that kind of thing. But I will note that those positions are honorable positions. And being the local character adds a lot to your community. It provides interest and entertainment, and we come to accept people as family, and we accept them for what they are, and kind of work from there. And it is a step above, town drunk and village idiots. And I'll note that there's always several contenders for village idiot, but we won't name any names today. But the quote that sticks with me is where somebody, and it could be Preston Summers, or although I suspect this quote came from Charles B. Cole, who had been the editor of the Abingdon Virginian for about 30 years. And he's talking about Abingdon in 1978. And he gives a long description of what Abingdon looks like. It's a pretty prosperous community in 1878. I may have said 1978. He gives a good description of it, and the town seems to have survived the Civil War well, and it's reasonably prosperous. But he describes Abingdon, and he says the population is about 1,500. There is no place of its size that in the state more noted for fashion, taste, and morality, with the usual proportion of loafers and gentlemen of leisure. And that's a quote that I like. He also notes that, and like all other small places where there is or has been considerable wealth, a right smart sprinkling of what some people would term aristocracy, but which in reality is nothing more than a decent observance of the conventionalities of life. And he also comments about, Abingdon's town council. And he says the town has a mayor and a common council who maintain the peace and dignity of the corporation and periodically enforce the hog law. And I'm not quite sure what the hog law covered, but I suspect it was that you didn't let them run loose. So I want to talk a little bit about how I got here. And I came to Abingdon in 1968. My family we sort of claimed The Radford, Pulaski County area is home. My family had been, my family had been in Southwest Virginia a very long time. My first ancestor that I was named after, Edward Morgan, had a place here in this county. It was a big county. I'm not sure where it was at that time exactly. May have even been in Tennessee, but he was here in 1775. So I have a long connection with this community. And my grandfather, Rufus Brown Morgan, was from Pulaski County, and several of you heard me tell this story, but I'll add it to the record. He was born in February the 9th of 1864. And about a month later, the Battle of Cloyd's Mountain took place, almost within sight of his house, and that event influenced his life greatly. His family owned some slaves. They've been there a long time. They were, fairly prosperous people. Civil War kind of ruined them, and money wasn't around. But my grandfather wanted to have a good education, and so he came to Emory and Henry, and managed to graduate finally when he was in 1904 when he was 30 years old. And so he managed to graduate from Emory and Henry, and he went on to become involved in the school systems in Pulaski County and was sort of the equivalent of the superintendent of schools for that community. He did not marry until he was 56 years old. And he was 62 when my mother was born. And he was 72 when his wife died, and he was left with a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old daughter, really out of the sticks. I knew this man. He lived to be 91, and I was, I think, 5 years old when he died, and I have memories of him. I have photographs of him, and he seems to have been a very remarkable man. And so I marvel at the fact that I knew somebody who was born during the Civil War and whose family had slaves. But the thing that I marvel about even more is that he knew his grandfather, who was Edward Morgan Jr., who was born in 1798. So there's 1 degree of separation between me and a guy who was born in 1798. And, it's a remarkable thing to consider. I'm going to talk again about how I got here, and I'm going to sort of read from a sermon that I wrote back in June of 2021, and I've cut out parts of this, but this may very well tell the story best. And I begin. My parents learned the hard way. There is a danger. If you take your children to church often enough, they may actually believe what they hear. And if you persist in this dangerous practice, there is a real possibility that not only will they believe what they have heard, but they might even start acting on those beliefs. And when that happens, there can be all kinds of trouble and embarrassment. I grew up as what was once described as an all-American boy. My family was in church every Sunday. I was a leader in my church youth group. I was also a Boy Scout. And when I was 15, I earned the Eagle Scout Award and received the God and Country Award the following year. My sophomore year in high school, I was selected as one of 12 Virginia Scouts to present Scouting's annual report to the governor, to Mills Godwin, who was then the governor of Virginia. I was active in athletics and made reasonable but far from exceptional grades. In 1968, I enrolled in Emory and Henry. I took several courses in religion and philosophy that presented some different perspectives on the Bible from what I grew up with in the Methodist Church, and exposed me to concepts of critical thinking and philosophical consistency and some other, thoughts about religion. In 1968, the United States was at war in South Vietnam, and there was a military draft by lottery to bring conscripts into the army to fight against our nation's communist enemies. The war and the draft were on the minds of every young man who was between 18 and 30 years of age, and we thought a lot about those issues, almost as much as we thought about sex, and that was a lot. As a student, I reflected on our country's involvement in the Vietnam War and the morality of that cause. I remembered how, as a Boy Scout, we recited the Scout Oath at each troop meeting. On my honor, I will do my best to do my duty to God and my country. I will obey the law. I will help other people at all times. I will keep myself physically strong, mentally awake, and morally straight. So 65 years ago, I still remember that. And I would know that a scout is trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. I don't have much of a memory for current events, but so that is still there. Well, that oath was that oath was repeated as if duty to God and duty to country were one and the same. But I began to question whether or not they were the same. Could your duty to God conflict with your duty to country? And if so, how did you resolve that conflict? And after hard prayer and reflection, I concluded that good duty to God was not the same necessarily as good duty to your country. And when the two responsibilities came into conflict, the first duty was to God, and that's where the trouble started. Over time, I determined that I could have no part in the war, and that I was opposed to all war. The feeling that came over me was not a decision; it is better described as a calling, something that I had to do regardless of the consequences. And as the saying went at the time, what if they get put on a war and nobody came? I decided that I would notify my draft board that I was a conscientious objector. I was certainly not the first person to find themselves a slave to their conscience. Years later, when I joined the Lutheran Church, I learned about Martin Luther and his crisis of conscience. Luther spoke out against the actions of the Pope and his minions and lackeys. He was threatened with excommunication and a possible death sentence. Luther was given a way out by the representatives of the Pope, but ultimately resisted, proclaiming, "Here I stand, I can do no other." This act of conscience on my part was not something my family ever expected to have to deal with. My father was an employee of the Radford Arsenal, where they made munitions for the Vietnam War. We were Methodists, and they did not do that kind of thing. My parents did not want me to be in the military, but this unexpected action on my part was a public embarrassment. It made us look unpatriotic. We had a young cousin who lived next door who served in Vietnam. And while I was dealing with this issue, he was killed in combat. At that time, my brother was only 10 years old. And from his perspective, it was bad enough that his big brother was a hippie. But to be a draft dodger and a coward, that was too much. Ultimately, my family realized that I was sincere in my beliefs, and they came to support me. And my father even typed out my application to the draft board. Well, I'm giving you the Reader's Digest condensed version of this story and omitting a number of details and plot twists, but surprisingly enough, I was recognized as a conscientious objector by the Pulaski County, Virginia Draft Board. And shortly after I graduated from Emory and Henry College, the Draft Board ordered me to perform 2 years of alternative service, working for a nonprofit service organization. I had two other conscientious objectors went to work here in Abingdon for that local group, one of which was Reese Shearer, who I think most of us know here, and that group was called Churches in Action. Our employment focused on creating employment opportunities for low-income people. And while I worked on that, I received little money for my service, but I managed. And about a year into my service, the federal court ruled that 6,000 conscientious objectors had been illegally ordered to perform alternative service because their draft numbers had never actually been drawn or come up. And I was one of those 6,000 who were released from service. But I did continue with my job for another year, and I worked basically my 2 years of service that I committed to. Well, when you make this kind of faith witness, you should kind of expect to be a voice howling in the wilderness. And there's no reason to anticipate that the rest of the world will see things as you do. And other young men at that time also experienced their own crisis of conscience, and they felt called to serve in our country through military service. And I respect them and don't wish to suggest their actions were any less valid or sincere than my own. And those were tough times for all of us who lived through it, and certainly for those who did not survive that experience. And 50 years later, when I look back on those events, I'm forced to ask myself, well, what difference did it make? And the truth is, I can't see that my active witness made any difference as far as stopping the war went. I was just one of millions of my generation who felt called to say, just give peace a chance. And it was our collective efforts that resulted in our nation's withdrawal from the conflict. Today, our nation is a trading partner with Vietnam and even allied on some certain issues. Well, I can say, however, that I was substantially changed by that experience. My outlook on life and personal politics were all shaped by that action. And I bore emotional scars for many decades. And this is one of the few times that I've really talked about that experience for a very, very long time. There was one other important impact on my life. A young woman living in Bristol, a recent graduate of King College, was looking for employment opportunities in social work. And she saw an article about the 3 conscientious objectors that appeared in the Bristol Herald Courier and decided to come to Abingdon and perhaps get a lead on a job opportunity. Well, that was my wife, Helen. And we have been married now for 52 years. And she decided that she loved me despite what I was, or perhaps because of it. And Helen had no delusions when she threw her lot in with mine. And I know that I would never have met her had I not gone down that road. So when my son asked those 2 inevitable questions, what did you do in the war, Daddy? And how did you meet my mother? Well, now you know. So that was what brought me here. And one of my first jobs, so to speak, as part of the Churches in Action Service was helping to organize Holston Mountain Arts and Crafts, and involved in the Cave House. And I met Eric Reese, who was with People Incorporated at the time, who put me in touch with Reese Shearer, who was here looking to work off his alternative service commitment. And so we became involved with creating the Cave House Cooperative. And I'm proud to say it's still in business 55 years or almost since that time. It's been a very vital institution. And I will comment about Holston Mountain Arts and Crafts, and which has played a big impact in my life. A number of women and craftspeople in the area found that they really wanted to do craft work, and created a market for them. And a number of people that came to this part of the world because we had that here. Nancy Garrettson was, somebody that was attracted here because we had that institution. And I do think that Holston Mountain Arts and Crafts has played a very important role in shaping the art life of our community. Prior to that, the only real sort of permanent offering, if you'd call it that, of art and craft in this part of the world was through the Virginia Highlands Festival, and it wasn't too much. So the folks that created Holston Mountain Arts and Crafts, they sort of went on to have a number of them studios up at William King. And William King, there was a great falling out. And William King, as it was developing, had a different direction. So those women decided they couldn't stay there. So they went and created the Arts Depot. Mm-hmm. And a lot of folks have come here and lived and done well in this part of our arts community. And I again trace it back to the founding of Holston Mountain Arts in 1971. Now, there was another event that happened about that time that Richard Smith over here, my old friend, ultimately became involved in. And there hasn't been much talked about it, but that was the Offender Aid and Restoration Program. You can feel free to correct me if I need some here. Offender Aid and Restoration was created, I think, maybe started about 1972. And Reese Shearer and Eric Reese were, I think, 2 of the primary instigators of bringing this about. But it was an organization that was, what's that? Did you say? Anyway, it was an organization that was created to provide support and various aid to people who were in the local county jail. And it was a very new experience. It turned out to be the first or second program of its kind in the country that was created in a rural area. And a lot of people really wanted this to work. One of its chief advocates was Bob, what's his last name?
That's so long ago, I don't remember.
Well, he was our sheriff, and he was Bob Clendenin. And Bob Clendenin was a remarkable man. And I first met Bob Clendenin when I was a residential advisor at Emory and Henry. And I'll not go too far down that road, but he was at Emory and Henry investigating the bomb that was set off under the Dean of Man's car in the winter of 1971. And that's a whole other story and a very interesting one, but we'll save that for another time. But Bob Clendenin was a very progressive fellow, and he was supportive of this organization. And it basically took volunteers from the community and connected them with prisoners and connected them with families. I was not an organizer of that particular activity, but I was a volunteer. And I was just, 21, 22 at the time. And I didn't quite know what to expect, but it was an interesting experience. We were in the jail that is down off of Park Street now. And I look back on it and just wonder about some of the ways that this was handled. There was sort of a day room where all the prisoners were kept up on the second floor, and you were a volunteer, and they just sort of turned you loose in there with the rest of the crowd. And, you were in there kind of doing your thing and meeting with them and talking with them. And I had several experiences of note, and I will mention that Henry McCarthy, I think several of you know Henry McCarthy, was the first director of that particular organization, and the second one was Richard Smith over here. So we had a long involvement with that. Well, again, you had all these prisoners up there. They were in the day room. They just turned you out, to mix and mingle and talk with folks and encourage and so on. And I had there were a couple of things of note. One of which was that a couple of prisoners that I remembered. One in particular was a man that I referred to as Old Man Greer. And Old Man Greer, I don't know how old he was. Probably he was certainly not as old as he looked, because he'd been led a very hard life. And he had come to Virginia by way of an unfortunate episode in North Carolina. He had been imprisoned in North Carolina, had been a trustee, and was looking for release, probably not too long the way. And so the progressive folks down in North Carolina took a bunch of the prisoners off to a baseball game. And while he was there, he managed to sort of wander off. And when the police caught up with him, somewhere along the way, he had gotten a gun, and he shot 3 police officers. And I don't know if they were killed or what, but he got up here into Washington County, and he was into the local jail. And he was a beat-up, hard-looking fellow that only had one eye. It was a very brilliant eye that worked, a very bright blue eye. And because of his reputation, he got his own cell. And he stayed in that just about 24 hours a day, because the local police were not going to take a chance on him, given what had happened. And he was there pending some sort of movement back to North Carolina where he would stand trial. He was as nice a fellow as you would ever want to meet, and I'm sure he was, as long as he was in that jail cell. But I'd go see him, and I'd talk with him, and he was doing little leatherwork projects, and making wallets and so forth, and he'd sell them to folks, and we talked a good bit. He didn't want to talk about the crimes and so forth they committed, because if they told you something, you might end up going to court and having to testify and that kind of thing. So you talk in generality. There were 2 events that I experienced while I was there going into court. And I'd really never been into a court before, but I had one of my fellows was a young man, I guess he was my age or maybe even a little bit younger, who was there in the jail, and I never quite understood why he was in there. It was something to do with a car that he bought and some altercation over it, and they tried to make him take it back and so forth. And the next thing you know, he's in jail. And I met with him a few times. He didn't talk a whole lot, but we had a ceramic wheel. He'd make some play stuff, and, and I'd sort of hang out a little bit while he did that. Well, one day I went down there and he was gone. And, I inquired about him. Well, it seemed that he had escaped. And he had been brought back about 3 hours later by his family. And what had happened was that he's there in the jail and he's on this crazy sort of thing that put him in there. And he finds out one day that his mother has cancer and she's not doing well, and his wife is leaving him, and it seems like there was some other little crisis that was thrown in there for good measure. And, the kitchen door where they got in food and that sort of thing and so on, it was open, and he couldn't stand it, and he hit the road and he went home. So he goes home and he sort of works through some things, and the family tells him he has to come back, and they bring it. So he's there in the back in the jail, and his trial on his escape comes up about 2 weeks later. And in Virginia, if you escape, you're pretty well bound to get 3 years for your escape. And here was this guy, who was just a young man, who was foolish and upset about his family. And it was a sad thing to think that he's going to get 3 years in prison. So all the local officials really wanted this program to work. They wanted it to be successful. And Emmett Urey, who I think several of you know Emmett Urey, he was the assistant Commonwealth's attorney at that time, and Emmett was handling this case. So I went to see Emmett, and I told him what had happened, and how this had shaped up, and how the boy, his family was supportive. They brought him back, and he was, was here. And I told him I hoped that it would, provide a little bit of, they could provide him a bit of mercy over this. So the hearing came, and if you don't have your own lawyer, you're the last thing heard. Everybody else has a lawyer, goes through, and if you're a prisoner, they're not going to move you to the front of the line anyway. So I went to the hearing that day where my person I was volunteering with was brought up, and Emmett presented it to the judge, and he said to Judge Tommy Hutton, who was also supportive of the program, that here's what happened, Judge. Here's what happened to this young man. His family brought him back, and Emmett said that he would suggest that maybe the court show a little bit of mercy in this case. And Judge Hutton, who could be a fairly hard-nosed person in his own way, he looked at the situation, and it's noted that I'm sitting in there. There's somebody from the community who has an interest in this young man is there. And so Judge Hutton looked at him and said, all right, we'll add 2 weeks to your sentence. And it was just an extraordinary thing that this boy gets, 2 weeks, for that. Well, there's always somebody who's going to take advantage of the situation. And about a week after that, there was another fellow who had been in for cattle rustling, who I won't say was the smartest boy that I ever met. He decided he'd go home on for a 3-hour furlough, and he comes back and so forth. And, so you could just see that there was a trend shaping up here. And so as luck would have it, I end up, not necessarily for him, but almost by default because of something else, in the courtroom when this guy's hearing comes up. And Emmett Urey says to the judge, this boy escaped. And the judge looks at the prisoner, and he looks at Emmett, and he looks at me. This whole cast of characters is the same, only the defendant is different. And the judge says 3 years. And that ended that. But it was a good experience, and I'll note one other thing that happened to me while I was there. And on one of those occasions, when I was there to follow, one of my prisoners and so forth, I ran into a boy I went to college with. And I should note at this time, I was very long-haired and bearded and rough-looking and wearing clothes that I bought from the Goodwill and that kind of thing. As I've said before, there weren't a whole lot of homes in this town that I would have been welcome in, and ultimately I became mayor, and it's a great town. But I was a fairly rough-looking fellow, so the court's getting ready to gear up, and I'm out in the hallway, and here comes this fellow that I went to graduated from Emory with, and we weren't close, we weren't really friends and so forth, but he saw me, and he had a big grin on his face, and it was like, well, Ed Morgan, how are you? What are you doing here? As if, I was here because of, some offense I was going to be up with. And I said, well, I'm a volunteer with Offender Aid and Restoration, and I'm helping out some folks that are, having trouble, and I'm trying to provide support and help to their family and so forth. What brings you here? Well, his mouth dropped and his face dropped and so forth. He was there for shoplifting, and he had been down to Walmart or someplace like that and stolen some golf balls. And this was a young man that wanted to go to law school, and now he's got this business, that is up here. So we go in, and I observe for my person that I'm volunteering with, and here's my associate from college. He comes up, and he had to grovel, beg, and plead, and tell his life story to the Judge Hutton, and how he had wanted to go to law school, and if he had this besmirchment on his record, he'd never get in. He begged and pleaded with the judge, to please dismiss this case. It would never happen again. He made restitution with the company and so forth and so on. And the judge did take pity on him, and he let him go. But that boy knew, and I knew, that there was no greater punishment that he could have had than to have me witness that and observe, what he had to go through, and know that he had been a shoplifter. There was nothing that could have happened that would have been, of a greater impact on him than what happened there. So, did you want to ask me something?
I was going to say, excuse me, I forgot, this is my mistake. I forgot to say we're also taking a little break about halfway through, which is right about now. So, okay, if we take a 10-minute break after answering the question? This gives everyone a chance to get up, hit the bathrooms, get another drink if you're curious.
That's the plan.
Come up with your own questions. Anyway, we got a question? Just point it at your face.
Okay, your first offender that you helped, the one-eyed guy from North Carolina, did you say he was making leather in his cell? Did you take that next door to Holston?
No, it wouldn't have met their standards, regrettably. It was like plastic stuff and pieces of pre-made, things. But anyway.
All right, a little preview.
But he was an interesting fellow to meet, and and the first time I'd ever been around anybody that had that kind of a history.
That's
all right.
scary.
So we're going to take a break.
Yeah, take a 5 or 10 minute break. I've got questions specifically for Ed. Get them in your head, and we'll work our way on those, and Ed will start back up here in about 5 or 10.
And if you're interested, I still have a few lies to tell.
Oh yeah, lots of story.
All right.
Okay, folks, we're going to start back up with Mr. Ed Morgan here, telling tales of the past, all the things he's been involved with. Anyone have any questions before we start back up? Again, if you are interested in the podcast version of the previous ones we've done here, just go to WEHC Radio. Okay, just look that up online, and once you're there, search Local Roots, and you will find the previous ones. One of which actually, I think I mentioned this to you like a month ago, but it was actually Reese and Kathy Shearer, and we had Eric and Sarah Reese. So the 4 of them were here, and we had this place full of Holston Mountain artists and folks. It was pretty amazing, and they had lots of historic items and some great tales. Anyway, enough of me talking. Back to Mr. Morgan here. Oh yes, EHC, Emory and Henry. It used to be a college, now it's a university, but yeah, Emory and Henry College, EHC.
All righty, thank you. I want to talk about another event that is sort of forgotten about, which was very important at the time. And I'm going to read a little bit here. I have a book which I'm working on, been working on far too long, and I hope to live long enough to see it published, but it focuses on the biodiversity of southwestern Virginia with a healthy dash of memoir. My book talks about what we have and what is unique, but also a lot about some of the events that have occurred here and how people have strived to, first of all, understand what we have in this part of the world that is unique and important in the natural world and why we need to be working on it. And I've been, again, very fortunate to be involved in some events that had some lasting implications for folks. And this piece I'm ultimately calling A Path Through the Woods, or How I Met Bill Gable. And I'll read a page or two of it, and then I'll sort of spare you that and try to, wrap it up a little shortly. In the summer of 1973, just a few months after I was married, I read an article in the local newspaper about Bill Gable, a young Lutheran minister living in the Conorock community in Washington County, Virginia, who had become embroiled in a struggle with the United States Forest Service. Bill was a fresh seminary graduate, and his wife, Jan Gable, had recently completed her medical residency. The idealistic young couple had been seeking the Lutheran parish that was the furthest distance from established medical care. Conorock community, located about 12 miles south of Damascus, was just what they were looking for. And Conorock had the added appeal of being a community where Bill Gable's father, John Gable, had spent time in the 1920s and 30s and produced a silent film called Under White Top for the Lutheran Church to support its mission programs in the rural community. And I'll digress and say that that film, Under White Top, if you'd like to see it, and I encourage you to see it, you can go to the College for Older Adults webpage on the Southwest Virginia Higher Education Center website and see what that community looked like back in 1934, when all the trees were cut down and we were in the midst of depression. And it's an excellent film. It is black and white and silent. The village of Conorock, we know where it's located, is sort of right underneath White Top Mountain and next to Mount Rogers. In 1966, just a few years before the Gables arrived in Conorock, the United States Congress had designated 109,000 acres of the Jefferson National Forest as the Mount Rogers National Recreation Area. And the stated purpose of the enabling legislation was to provide the public outdoor recreation use and enjoyment of the area in the vicinity of Mount Rogers, the highest mountain in the state of Virginia, and to the extent feasible, the conservation of scenic, scientific, historic, and other values of the area. And later acquisitions and transfer of Forest Service wilderness areas to the Mount Rogers NRA has since increased this management area to over 200,000 acres. Now, the legislation had been sponsored by Virginia 9th District Congressman Pat Jennings, and Jennings was a Democrat, and he viewed the NRA as a way to provide both recreation and economic opportunities in that part of the district. And the National Recreation Area was to be administered by the Forest Service. While the purpose of the legislation might have been laudable, the implementation process did not go well and began to immediately be rejected by a lot of local residents. Well, and I'll digress a little bit here, but the legislation called to create a place where the public could recreate, where tourists would come to an area and be involved in it, and nobody was quite sure exactly what this was really meant. But the Forest Service began to work on plans, and they proposed, for example, that a ski resort would be built on Pine Mountain, adjacent to Mount Rogers, and a scenic road modeled kind of after the Blue Ridge Parkway would be built along the crest of the roads there. And at the same time, Appalachian Power Company saw an opportunity to build a pumped storage facility for generation of electricity on the New River over in Grayson County, Virginia. And the two things were to be sort of combined together. You'd have the lake where there would be recreation opportunities and so forth, and then you'd have the Mount Rogers area with skiing and scenic drives and so forth. Well, they drew up the plans, but things turned bad very quickly. And the main problem was, first of all, that Congress had allocated money to acquire land, but they didn't propose any money for the actual creation of the development. And so the Forest Service felt that they had a mandate to acquire this land, and they were prepared to take it in any way they could. And that meant that they would enter into eminent domain proceedings and just take your land if it was to be part of the plan. And Appalachian Power had also received approval for this over in their on the New River as well. And so they began to acquire land also. When Appalachian Power took over, or when they were looking to create the place where the dam would flood, they needed to clear out some of the buildings and structures that would be left underwater and provide and create a hazard for boating. There were farms and silos and houses and that kind of thing. And the simplest way to get them out of the way was to burn them to the ground. And so here you would see farmers whose families had lived on some of these places for generations, seeing their homes and their life work burned to the ground. Now that's not to say that they didn't receive compensation for it, but they just plain didn't want to sell. So local residents in Grayson County and in neighboring Ashe County, North Carolina, they began to organize very quickly against this. The dams were going to be located in Grayson County, Virginia, but most of the flooding would be in North Carolina. And let's see if I can turn it here. And at the time all this was developing, I was employed by People Incorporated, the local community action agency. And with permission of our director, I went to Colorado and called on Bill Gable and offered my services to Bill in this process. Although I have to admit, I had no real idea what services I had to offer. But I was young and enthusiastic, and so Bill took me on and served as a mentor to me. And I began to visit these folks whose land was being acquired by eminent domain. And I listened to their stories and heard their talk about how, this government that they had supported and paid taxes to and, pledged allegiance to, now they're out here taking their land, and they were mad about it. Opposition developed, and again, I tried to work on the opposition to this, but I also hoped that maybe there would be some median ground in between in this struggle. And I developed good relationships with the local community, but also had good relationships with the Forest Service. And they saw me as sort of a middle person and told me this, that they saw me as somebody who could relate to both sides. And I listened to everybody's situation. We felt like the best way to find to take care of this problem was William Wampler. And William Wampler, was our congressman at that time. He was as bald as, he was affectionately known as the bald eagle of the Cumberlands. And Wampler was a Republican. He served as the ranking minority member on the House Agriculture Committee. And I ultimately managed to set up a meeting at Lutheran Church in Conorock involving Forest Service, local residents, and Congressman Wampler. And I was quite optimistic about it. My hopes were soon dashed, though. We had a 4-hour-long meeting, which is a pretty big deal to have with your congressman. And he had asked that the press not be there, wanted to have an open discussion, but notes were taken, extensive notes were taken, and they were eventually provided to the press. But after all was said and done, Congressman Wampler said, and I quote, that he believed in this. He, believed that it was the best long-term interest of the community, and that while there was no development money available at present, sometime in the future, after the Vietnam War was resolved and victory was achieved in the war on poverty, money would be available to implement the project. Well, that wasn't very satisfactory, but we recognized that if we weren't going to be able to stop it, we needed to work with local people to find opportunities to take advantage of it. And so I became involved in, again, community organizing. I raised the money for the White Top Mountain Maple Syrup Company, and I helped, I played a kind of a critical or implemental role in the introduction of Christmas tree farming in that community. And in 1975, based on my community work, I received a fellowship from the Ford Foundation's Rural Leadership Development Program. And it was really something. They gave my wife and I money to live on and travel on for a year. And we went to Canada and spent time in England, and it was great. Well, the Appalachian Power Company project, it was, let me see here. Well, let me note, first of all, that while I was working on this, there were people that I did not, or in opposition to this, there were people I didn't know who were involved in this. And there was a group called Citizens for Southwest Virginia, which began to circulate a petition demanding an end to the proposed ski resort and called for a development based on traditional outdoor activities, camping, hiking, hunting, and fishing. And this petition documented the names and mailing addresses of 2,843 signees and was sent to the Forest Service. And again, the opposition was gearing up over in the Grayson County area along the New River, and people began working on trying to get the New River designated as a national scenic river, because you legally can't impound a scenic river. So they worked on that strategy and ultimately were successful. It only took 11 years, but they actually stopped this, got a designation of National Scenic River status for the New River. Former President Gerald Ford had a little bit of a role in that process, but they were ultimately successful, and that ended the proposed pump storage dam on the New River. Well, John Warner, best known as Elizabeth Taylor's husband, was running for the Senate at that time. And he was again trying to get elected. And he got a copy of this petition and the 2,843 signatures and names and addresses of people who were opposed to this project. And he sent out a letter to all these folks, and one of them he sent to me and said that if he was elected, he'd put an end to it. Well, that got my attention. He was running against fellow Andrew, I don't know, I'll find his name here. He was running against a man who had lived in Abingdon for a number of years, and it was hard to vote against him, but by golly, I did. And Warner went on to be elected, and he was elected in Virginia by 5,000 votes. And what that tells me is that, this particular episode was very critical in his, electoral future. That pretty well ended the proposed scenic drives and ski resorts and so forth. But the Forest Service came up with another plan to create a series of lakes and camping areas and so forth, like Bear Tree Lake. And so they drew up a plan that would call for about 8 or 10 of these around through the National Recreation Area. Around that time, the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, which is now the Department of Wildlife Resources, they did a trout stream survey, a cold water stream survey. And what they found was that there were over 100 miles of native trout water in the Mount Rogers National Recreation Area. That's more than is in the Great Smokies National Park. And some of the, most of the places where the Forest Service was proposing to build the dams was where those streams were. And the Forest Service's own policies prohibited degrading by dams and so forth any native trout stream. So that one went out the window. In 1977, the Norfolk and Western abandoned the rail line that ran from Abingdon, Virginia to West Jefferson. And that rail line, had been the vehicle that had been created to haul timber out of the Mount Rogers National Recreation Area. It's estimated by the Hassinger family that over 4 million board feet of lumber was hauled out of that area. And it's hard to get your head around how much timber that actually was. And again, the Norfolk and Western abandoned that line in 1977, and several Abingdon residents, Dr. David Brillhart and Dr. French Moore Jr., and French was the mayor of Abingdon at that time. They began the process to acquire this rail line and ultimately to turn it into a trails measure. And a lot of us know the end of the story, so to speak. Virginia Creeper Trail has really become a major tourist venue for the town of Abingdon, but it's been particularly important for Damascus, sort of brought Damascus back from the dead. They were just Damascus was dead and stinking, and that's the best way that you can describe it. But it brought life into Damascus, and ultimately, what I think is the real takeaway on this is that as a result of the Creeper Trail, many of the original Mount Rogers National Recreation Area's goals, what they hope to achieve, for the community and so forth, have been accomplished. And they've been accomplished by the by the Creeper Trail line. And the great irony to me is that the vehicle that was created to transport wealth from this region is now returning tourism dollars back into it. And the great, development schemes and so forth that have been proposed, and the massive dams and ski resorts and all that stuff, that have been proposed, those goals that they hope to achieve, all that have been accomplished, and not by those big developments, but rather by just a simple path through the woods. And that's a great message and a great takeaway on that. Now, there have been a number of other, developments over the years and so forth that came from that. But the Mount Rogers area was the first real environmental battle that was waged in this part of the world. And some of the people who were involved in that later became involved in anti-strip mining activities. And the effort to stop the pump storage dam at Brumley Gap. So a lot of people cut their teeth on some of these experiences and knew how to put them together. But that is an event that was of critical importance. There was something in the newspapers about it every day, for years. But ultimately, it was won by the folks who were, striving to protect the environment. One other comment I'll make before I move on to another topic.
Nobody can hear
related to that.
At least the ladies towards the back keep signaling at
away
me.
from me here.
It's just a lot harder when there's a lot of people here talking.
Well, I guess that it is much the way I've been talking for.
Turn it up a little bit.
For a long time. But the Mount Rogers area really was an important sort of turning point, in this part of the world, and as far as protecting it. The point I wanted to make, though, is this: I live over on Bradley Street, and if I look about 150 yards away, I see the Abingdon Olive Oil Company. And the Abingdon Olive Oil Company house was built by the Hassinger family. And the Hassinger family came down here from Pennsylvania after they cut down all the trees in Pennsylvania, and they came down here and lived on Bradley Street, or just off of it there, and built a nice house. And about 150 yards from them, over past the old Kroger's building, is Montcalm, and that was a house that was built by the Mingy family. And the Mingy families put the railroad, ultimately created the railroad that was used to haul the timber out. And there were a cluster of people involved with the railroad that lived right around that area of Bradley and so forth. But these were the people that cut down the forest. Now, one of the great ironies is that we're able to go into that forest today and see the trees and enjoy it, recreation. And, it's owned by the federal government. This land is your land. This land is our land. And we're able to do that because they cut out all the trees and basically destroyed the forest that was there. And when they did, an awful lot of the land was worthless. And some of it, after it had been cut down, there were fires that came through and burned everything that was left, and even burned up the topsoil. So the land was largely worthless. And the federal government, in its wisdom, came by and created the National Forest System and bought up that land. And today you can go out there and find that it looks pretty much like it did before, the Hassingers and others cut it all down. But it's one of those things where you see sort of good come out of what you might perceive as real harm. And I don't mean to degrade the memory of some of those timber barons and so forth too much, because it was a different time, different set of values, and some things seemed like you could never be the end of it. But we are dealing with part of their legacy, and part of that legacy is also the folks that work to preserve the Forest Service the National Recreation and area and keep it as it is today. And that kind of covers that. So, does anybody have any questions about my thoughts on that?
If you have questions, I'll bring the mic around to folks so we can try to catch those.
I have a few questions. I have a couple.
Okay.
Do I need to get the mic then? Okay.
Just point it at your face like this.
I will point it right at yeah, I was wondering, you mentioned that the Houstons and Austins were here, like it was an abundant, rich area. And I'm just curious if you know what the reasons were for the Houstons and Austins to camping from here to Texas. And I had one other question.
This back to Ed.
I'll forget the figure, but between 1830 and 1860, there were over 1 million people who lived in the state of Virginia, which is also included in West Virginia now, that packed up and left. And some of them left of their own accord. There were people that saw opportunities in places like Texas and Virginia at that time could be a hard place to buy land and a hard place to, to really get a new opportunity. And they saw Texas as being the up and coming place. Now, when I mentioned that 1 million people that packed up and left, not all of them left on their own accord. Many of them were slaves. They were forced from Virginia and trotted off and trotted down Route 11 over here and Main Street in Abingdon on their way to the Deep South, to work on farms and plantations in that area. But the eastern part of Virginia, where they'd grown tobacco and cotton and some other things, a lot of that land was worn out. And so, it wasn't producing like it was. And again, a lot of people just up and left. The Austins, they were from up the road in Austinville near Wythe County. The Houstons, I think, were up in the Shenandoah Valley. The Crockett's were just down the line from Tennessee. But an awful lot of people from Virginia, packed up and left and, went to find, if not greener pastures, land that they could afford to buy. And I won't remember the name of the author, but there is a book called Bound Away, and it is a description of this diaspora that took place, for Virginia, where everybody left, and it's a piece of our history they didn't teach us when we were in the 3rd and 4th grade. So,
Lincoln's family.
Lincoln.
Lincoln.
Yeah,
Second question,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's right.
Virginia, yeah,
Thanks for
Kentucky.
I also was curious if sort of, I guess, Daniel Boone times and the settlement of like Wolf Hill, et cetera, what the Indian tribes were in the area other than the creek. Do you know, like, sort of that period?
Mr. Jenny might know that better than I do.
Shawnee and Cherokee primarily. Shawnee and Cherokee primarily. There were some other smaller tribes, and those were the ones that would move back and forth into this area, both for trade and for hunting and that sort of thing.
Okay. Linda, did you want to ask a question?
I'm interested to know, and I think you might have more of an inside knowledge of when the Creeper Trail above Damascus might be repaired.
That man right there.
That's the man who would know. Yeah. You want to give us some update?
Yes.
Go to the website, vacreepertrail.us. You will see 2 separate websites there. One is the destruction of the 19 trestles that were eradicated, essentially, plus samples of the trail surface. The other website on there is recovery. At the present time, the announcement was supposed to be made October 1st on the winning contractor. There are 3 qualified contractors, one from Georgia, one from Pennsylvania, one from Montana. They are very anxious. They were waiting to be told, October 1st, and they were going to pack up and they were going to be here within a few days to start work. The government is shut down. I won't get into reasons why. But, and when the government shutdown ends, we anticipate the announcement will be made. The winning contractor, and within, I would say, 3 or 4 days after that, work will start. Everyone in Damascus is highly anxious. I have 35 lodgings listed for long-term lodging. They want, because no one's renting right now. It's down 70%. They're ready to go. We anticipate about 200 workers coming in looking for lodging. And hopefully they don't all come to Abingdon. Hopefully they'll come to Damascus.
There you go.
So when the government comes back in, things will start happening.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Richard. Other questions, anybody? Okay, here we go. Wondered at your face.
Hi, I was wondering what you think some of the most, interesting tensions, challenges, opportunities Abingdon is facing in the next 10 or 15 years in terms of its growth and progress.
It's definitely a good one. Definitely a good question. One I think about all the time.
Thank you. I think the biggest challenges that Abingdon is going to have, will be dealing with its success. And it is a good place to live, but we don't have a whole lot of, we don't have a whole lot of housing that is available. There's a lot of people that want to come here, and there's a strong need for affordable housing, and I think that will continue to be a real challenge for some time in the future. There's some efforts underway to build affordable housing for people who are working age, so to speak, and that's important over the long haul because you need to have people who are working in our factories and providing services and so on, and they don't need to be making long-term commutes. And that kind of long-term commutes contributes to sprawl. So I think housing and will be a problem, and in general, managing growth I think will be a real challenge in the future years that we have here too. Let me just talk about my time with the town, and maybe I'll touch on that a little bit because we've had some challenges. I ran for office the first time for the Abingdon Town Council in 1998, and you have some water, just plain water. Excuse me. I ran for town council in 1998.
Good glass of
and
water.
I ran because I was concerned about, as most people who are motivated, I felt like we were losing the things that made our town great, a wonderful place to live. And one of the final straws for me was the road, quote, improvements that took place on the east end of Abingdon. We needed a new bridge, but we had a 4-lane road put in, from coming into Abingdon, and then all of a sudden it narrows down here. But it stripped out a lot of businesses, and it left a very sterile environment that we had in that part of the area. You lost your trees, you lost some interesting houses and so forth that were along the way. And I saw that, and I felt like we needed to be managing growth better. So that prompted me to run. Excuse me. I lost by 50 votes. And it was a real disappointment. I expected to win, but I lost by 50 votes. But Abingdon has an election every 2 years. And so in 2000, I decided that I would run again. But this time that I would actually get some advice from somebody who had successfully managed to be elected. And the person I called on was Bucky Boone. And Bucky Boone was served on the Washington County School Board for a number of years. And Bucky and I had a lot in common. We were both on sort of the fringes of a lot of things. We both had kind of a social history and, that kind of thing. And Bucky managed to get elected. And so I asked Bucky how you did it. And he said, you have to go door to door. And so when you're breaking into the community and, you haven't done this before, you need to go door to door. So I went door to door. And I think I knocked on over 1,000 doors in this town. There weren't many that I missed. I was determined, particularly after I'd lost the first go-round by what didn't seem like a lot of votes, that I would do that. And my wife, Helen, was, very supportive. And I'd work all day, at my day job. And then I'd come home, she'd have me a sandwich, and I'd go knock on doors until dark. And it's a hard thing to do, particularly in a place like this, but you get better at it. It's not an easy thing to go knock on a door and just a stranger and say, hi, here I am, and I'm running for election and why and so forth. But as you go, you get, like I say, you get better at it, and you begin to have conversations with people, and they tell you what their concerns are, and you think, oh, I hadn't appreciated that. So you get better at your little 30-second pitch that you have with these people as you go. And the other thing about it is that the neighborhoods we have here, they look very different when you're on foot. It's when you're walking them, you get a feel for the distance and what the roads are like and what the yards are like and that kind of thing. It's a whole different perspective than just driving down the street and so forth. So, I did that. I knocked on literally 1,000 doors over a period of a couple of months in all kinds of weather, evenings and Saturdays and Sundays. And when that next election came around, I was elected and I was the top vote getter. So I was pleased, to have that opportunity. When I was elected, I had a good mentor. And that mentor was Lois Humphreys, the woman that the little park on Main Street is named after. Lois served as Abingdon's mayor for 10 years. And she kind of took me under her wing, and I was willing to let her. I'd had several good mentors growing up, and Lois, when she came on the council, she had been sort of the odd person out, and it was sort of an old boys' school, and she wasn't one of the old boys, and it was a long time, she said, before she was really welcomed into the fold. And she was determined it was going to be different for me. And I listened to Lois, and we spent several hours together driving, going on trips and so forth in the early days. And she would tell me, kind of the backstory and the history of how they got where they were. And some things, as an outsider, you look at and say, oh, God, why the hell did they do that? Well, she could tell you why. And sometimes it made sense, or it was the best decision that they could make. So I'm very grateful to Lois for the time that she spent with me, and she helped me to get off and to, have a successful start. Now, there's a couple of things that I will note about, the election process. The first time I ran, I lost. The next time I ran, I was unopposed. Or no, the next time I ran, I won. The third time I ran, I was unopposed. And then the next time, I won by 2 votes. And wow. Don't tell me the votes don't count. I was literally elected by 2 votes. And Bob Howard and I I campaigned with Bob. I tried to be supportive of my, associates and colleagues. And we went out several times and campaigned together. And the night, the Sunday before the election, and we had town council the next day, so we couldn't knock on doors. But the Sunday beforehand, I told Bob I was going out. Do you want to go with me and knock on doors again? Nah, he thought he'd done enough, and, he needed to mow his grass. And so then on Tuesday, I was elected beat him by 2 votes. And I didn't take any pleasure with beating Bob at all, because he was very capable and somebody who really loved the town. But anyway, I was elected by 2 votes, and then I was elected mayor that year by 2 votes and continued to serve. And in the period that I was on the council, we had a couple of challenges. And one of the first one that came up was the, if I can find my memory here, was the Walmart struggle that we had in the early 2000s. And the Walmart company had proposed to build a Walmart store over at exit 14. And I wasn't very enthusiastic about having a Walmart store in town. And at that time in particular, Walmart had a reputation for destroying communities, destroying their downtowns, for not really, for bad architecture and all those kinds of things, that came along. I wasn't keen about, having a Walmart. Neither were a lot of other people in town. But the thing that really concerned me was the traffic study that had been done by the developers. And they showed that, and the developers were going to make some major improvements at their expense out of the exit 14, which was going to improve exit 14. But their own study said that it was going to make a mess down on Jonesboro Road, and particularly at the junction of Jonesboro and Main Street, and even over at the junction of 19 and Main Street. And nobody was proposing to pay for that. VDOT wasn't proposing, the developers weren't proposing, and it was going to be something that fell on the Abingdon taxpayers to deal with. And that wasn't right. You allow somebody to make money from developing and having the store and so forth, and the citizens and taxpayers have to suffer from it. And it did make the kind of mess that we have out at exit 19 today, VDOT ended up picking up. So I was opposed to it. And we had several struggles along the way, one of which was, and I was on the planning commission at the time that this was coming up, but our town manager, the developers had applied for a preliminary plat approval, which our town manager said didn't amount to anything. And he assured us it, quote, just didn't amount to anything. Well, that didn't amount to anything basically gave them 6 years to actually complete the development. And that was a big deal from my perspective. But, we managed to hold them off for 6 years. And it would take me a good while to reflect on all the, the work that we did on it. But they had to go through all the hoops. And eventually they decided they didn't want to go through those hoops. But over in Buchanan County, they were willing over there to pay them to come and do it. And so they built a 2-story Walmart over in Buchanan County at taxpayers' expense to a large degree. And ultimately they came out to exit 19 here, and with significant support from the local government as well. But we held it off in Abingdon. That experience taught me very quickly that our town did not have the tools it needed to manage growth. People were already concerned about traffic in town and pedestrian safety, and really wanted to make it a much more walkable community. And we had been working on some safety improvements and did the things like Depot Square and the walkways at the Barter Theater and at the library. We did some work on that, but it was clear that we did not have the tools for managing this kind of development. So I did my research, read a lot, and I championed several laws, ordinances that were enacted by the town of Abingdon. The first one was the Entrance Corridor Overlay District. And in Virginia, if you have we have historic districts, but Virginia law permits you to create a special zoning on the roads leading into the historic districts. And so like Main Street, we designated it as a historic district, overlay district, and several of the other streets in town, got that designation. The theory behind it is that you don't want to be driving through a place full of cinder block, strip zones and that sort of stuff, and then all of a sudden you're in a pristine historic district. So they enabled us to create architectural standards and design standards for those roads leading into the historic districts. And I figured, well, over the generations it had an impact, but our town was growing and it had almost immediate impact. Among other things, you had to build a brick building instead of, just an old cinder block shell or something like that. And one of the things that I was taught was that if you implement these design standards, people will take them to heart and they'll recognize them as that having a good looking building is a good way to do business. It's a good way, it's good for everybody, any way you look at it. So, that was implemented and we put in those design standards. And the other thing that we put in, and that I'm proud to say I championed, was a special use permit for retail buildings over 50,000 square feet in area. And a little bit later on, when we got into the Meadows development and so forth, that was something that was a useful tool. But anyway, we implemented those design standards and put them into place. And somehow we managed to hang on for 6 years, and we don't have Walmart in town today. And I'm somewhat proud of that, the fact that we have, because it would have drastically changed, the character of the community. Now, when the Meadows conflict came along, and starting at about 2014, I supported the Meadows development, and a lot of people could not understand why I would do that, particularly when I've been so aggressive for 6 years holding off, the Walmart thing. But it's one of the lessons that you learned when you're on the town council is that the good things, the things that make our town a good place to live, they come with a price tag. The Barter Theater, the Creeper Trail, the architecture, the trees, the streets, everything that you have, it comes with a price tag, and money has to be found. And you can either get that money through, property taxes, which is, I think, the last thing you want to do, because you do want to make it a good town to live in, or you can do it through meals and lodging. And Abingdon brings in a lot of money through meals and lodging, about twice as much as we bring in property taxes. But I looked at the amount of at the whole package of the Meadows project, and for starters, we were going to make both the town and the county never put a nickel into it. We're each going to gain $750,000 to $1 million a year in new tax revenues. That's a lot of money right there that we needed. Plus, for an investment of about, it was estimated $10 million, and I think ended up being about 12. The town helped put in the cost that would lead into the sports complex, and Food City gave us $2 million worth of property for the sports complex, and then money for the development of the sports complex. We got a sports complex, which has been very useful for, driving, first of all, providing recreational opportunities for our community, but also supporting a source of revenue for our meals and lodging taxes. There was going to be 400 new jobs. It was estimated that 750 people would work in the Meadows complex. 400 of those jobs would be new ones. We were going to get a safety realignment of Green Springs Road, which had been a problem along the way that VDOT was going to pick up on. And we were also going to get a redesign of Exit 17, which has been a nightmare for everybody for 30 years or so. And we got that developed, and the state of Virginia was going to invest $35 million in that. And I and my 4 council members and so forth, you looked at that package, and the general consensus was that this was something that wasn't going to come along again. And the other problem was that we didn't own the property. It wasn't town property that was being developed. It was owned by the Food City, ultimately purchased by Food City. And there were legal limits of what controls that we had over it. So again, we had some design standards, on retail buildings. We had other ordinances that were put in place, and the development was not going to be on our main street. It was off on, a separate area. It was, as most everybody here knows, it was terribly, terribly controversial. And I personally lost a lot of friends, and a lot of people just didn't respect me anymore. And, some of them still don't speak to me, but close to 10 years, most of us have kind of worked through it, including me, and, got over it. But it was an opportunity that I didn't think that we could pass up. And, I certainly did not enjoy that experience, but I felt that over the long haul for the community, that it was in our best interest, and so did my fellow council members. And I've been privileged when I served to served with other very capable people who cared every bit as much about the town as I did. But that Meadows project pretty well ended it for me. I was defeated after that when I ran for election. Re-election, the opposition took control of the narrative. Guess we allowed them to do that, and they told their story. I might add, it's hard, after you've been elected and you're running for office, to go knock on those doors after you work all day and go do the town's business now, and to have time to campaign. It's a hard thing, but I was defeated, very soundly defeated in 2000. I didn't have a whole lot of confidence in the people that replaced me, but the voters had their choice, and as Thomas Jefferson says, people get the government that they deserve. But we've had a very difficult experience after that. All in a short period of time, all the people who had been long-term, council members and so forth were gone. There was a huge staff turnover, and virtually all the institutional memory of the local government was wiped out, and it produced a very difficult situation that, I think they're finally, we have a good, stable government who's doing a good job. But it was a very difficult period for the town. And one of the things that you see is that this controversy came up really because people love this town and they wanted to preserve it. And a lot of folks who led the opposition had moved here from places that had been screwed up. They left those places because they got to be unpleasant and they didn't want to live here. And they came down here, by God, they weren't going to see this place ruined. So, that's kind of how it worked out for me. I had another challenge last year that I was there. There was a opioid treatment clinic that opened up on Valley Street. And a lot of people weren't happy about having that kind of people, on Valley Street in our historic district. But we had no legal control over it at all. And I will say about that I went and actually visited the clinics and so forth and found out the kind of good work they were trying to do. And people hadn't appreciated how serious the opioid crisis was when that came up. And then the other factor that we had was that we had an employee that I respected and thought the world of who misappropriated town funds. And you found out the hard way that you didn't have the tools in place, to really detect that kind of thing. That was probably the hardest thing that I dealt with while I was there. But I haven't talked about my time with the Martha Washington Inn. We'll save that for another day. But that's my experience with the town. Let me say how grateful that I felt I was, to have the opportunity to serve the town. This is a wonderful place, and to be able to help it shape its future and have an impact on its future was an extraordinarily opportunity, and I'm very grateful that I was given that. But I think our government is local government's in good hands, and I'm pleased that I was at least part of the story for a while. And I'll hand this to you.
Linda had another question for you.
Actually, I think he answered it in a sense. I was going to ask you if you have any regrets over those decisions about the Meadows development, because I was sitting, I'm from Elder Spirit, so I literally was sitting in the geographic area where a lot of the opposition came from. And I was new to Abingdon relatively when all of that broke loose. And so I was very aware. Your name was only a name at that point. Mm-hmm. I didn't know you. I didn't know your history. I didn't know anything about you. But I was very aware that you got defeated after that controversy and all. And as I say, I mainly heard, from the Kings Mountain community. They overlooked that area. Mm-hmm. So they were the ones, in a way, most affected by that development.
Well, it'll ruin the creeper trail. That's the thing that I realized. Anytime anything new is proposed around here, it'll ruin the creeper trail, And when Elder Spirit was proposed, the first thing I heard was, it'll ruin the Creeper Trail. And then the folks moved into Elder Spirit, and I have many friends in Elder Spirit and have been a good supporter of that community over the years. But right away you heard, it'll ruin the Creeper Trail. And, surprisingly enough, the Creeper Trail seems to have withstood, the development and so on. And
Everything but the lead.
What's that?
Everything but the lead.
Yes. But locally, you drive, you go down there and you don't really appreciate there's anything much going on over there. But I don't have regrets about it because, again, I spent a lot of time thinking about this and thought and prayer about it. And, it was a hard experience, but I felt like it was in the town's best interest. And one of the things that I was sort of proud of in some ways is that we had a public hearing about it. And, and a lot of people said that that we weren't listening to the voters. Well, we listened to the voters in a lot of ways. He had many different hearings and, this and that and so forth. We did an awful lot of listening. The problem wasn't that we weren't listening. The problem was that we weren't necessarily doing what they wanted us to do. And we had a meeting, public hearing over at the Higher Education Center, and we had almost 500 people there. And there was a pretty agitated group of people. And here I am. I'm chairing this meeting with, 400 to 500 agitated people. And we've done a lot of preparation to make sure that meeting would go smoothly. And we got through it, and everybody that wanted to be heard, not that we did what they wanted us necessarily to do, everybody who wanted to be heard was heard. Nobody was thrown out. Nobody was arrested. And there was only one person there that I had to call as being out of order. And I was very proud of that we had a successful, experience and managed to work our way, through that, which was a hard experience for the town, and I have realized over the years that when you have a place where there's a lot of stakeholders, a situation, whether they're citizens or your church or whatever, that if at all possible, change needs to take place slowly and deliberately. But it seldom works out to where you can manage it that way. But if you can, you want to manage it as carefully as you can. But sometimes you have to respond to both challenges and opportunities. But I continue to feel that I did what was in the long-term best interest of the community. So others, Walter.
All right, Walter.
If you had a magic wand, what three things would you like to see done in Abingdon?
I'm not sure. What I would say to that. I think one of the things I would encourage the town to look hard at is how we manage our short-term rental properties. Abingdon needs to be a good place to live in. And, when you have short-term rental properties, they're often owned by people that don't live here, that don't have stakes in the community. And I think it's important that, those situations be managed very carefully. And I think that's the secret to a community is having people that are stakeholders and live here. One of the things that I've noticed and people have pointed out to me is with the physicians in many cases we have here. It used to be that you had Dr. Brellhart and you had the Abingdon medical group and so forth. All these people, they owned their practices, they lived here, their children were in school here, they were involved in the community, they were stakeholders. And, now you have people that don't own their own practices, they're employees, they come and they go, and, don't have that long-term investment in the community. And I think that affects ultimately the health that we have here. And that's, one of the things that's really sticking out on my mind. Another thing that I think would be a wonderfully interesting thing to have happen would be to create a trail that would go from Abingdon by way of Hillman Highway, say, that would run up and connect with the Salt Trail, and that way you'd have a connection of, with from here to Damascus or here to Saltville. I think it'd be good for everybody's economy if we could work something out. Might even be possible. I'm not sure, but I think building on trails and bike accessibility is kind of important for our future. And I would like to, I don't know, I feel like our arts community remains something that really needs to be, strengthened and an integral part of our community. We're so fortunate to have, Holston Mountain Arts and the Arts Depot and the William King and the Barter Theater. It's a rare community that has that kind of combination here, and we don't need to take it for granted. It's part of what really makes this a good place to live. And I would note also the good work that's been done by our town to create a tree commission, try to manage our trees in a smart way. People hate to see our big trees cut down, but it's something that we need to be mindful of and recycle them appropriately. We have these great ash trees that are on Main Street and other places, 3 feet, 4 feet in diameter, and they're all being killed by the emerald ash borer, and it'll probably cost about $10,000 a tree to take them down. So being smart about how we manage our trees is very important for the future of our town, and I'd like to see it greener. I'd really like to see more trees here and more of that kind of planting and so forth here. That's kind of on my short list, what comes to mind.
All right, excellent. Anybody else have a question for Mr. Ed here? All right, well, I'd just like to say thank you very much, Ed, for sharing so much history today.
Thank you all for coming here.
Please stick around and ask more questions, hang out, have a cider, have some fun. Thank you.
All righty. Thank you so much for being here.